Welcome to week 2 of Bio 216 here online for the first summer term, I should say. I hope you all are acclimating to the class very easily and well. There's been a lot of discussion on the discussion boards. That's been great. It's been really fun to get to know all of you. You're from all over the United States, which is great. Some of you even come from international homes. So that's been really fun. I hope that week 1 was not too challenging for you. That was not the goal. Those are some foundational concepts that are very important to anatomy and physiology in both semesters, 215 and 216. Those concepts will come up throughout the entire term. So these will not be the last time that you see these concepts. But make sure that you have a really good handle on that before we kind of go forward. So in this week, we are starting from the endocrine system here. This is our first system. And the endocrine system can be very challenging, but I know a lot of you in your exam were really excited for this system, which is great. Some of you enjoy a challenge. So endocrine system gets very heavy in like the physiology side. It can be difficult because it's all systems working together, essentially, which seems a little backwards because we're taking one system at a time, but essentially the endocrine system has parts from every other system of the body. So it's interesting, it's challenging, but it's so very important. So let's get started here. So the endocrine system is all about hormones. So when we talk about hormones, we're talking about chemical messengers that send a message somewhere else in the body to induce a physiological change. And the idea is to maintain that homeostasis. So if something in your body or internal environment is not normal, okay, perhaps the endocrine system will send out a chemical messenger to those target cells and tell them to do something different in order to bring whatever level it is back to its normal. So endocrine, quite frankly, means secreting hormones into the internal environment. And what we mean by that is the bloodstream. So hormones are made by certain tissues of the body called endocrine tissues, and we're going to talk about those today. And then they secrete them into their very neighboring blood vessels, which a lot of the time start with capillaries and then arteries or veins. Now different from exocrine. Okay, so exocrine is secreting something into a duct or to the outside environment rather than the bloodstream. And so over on the side here, I have an example. This is an image from the book. So here's the thyroid gland, for example. That is an endocrine gland. And the thyroid gland makes its hormones, which are T3 and T4. We'll get to that. And secretes them into the blood vessels within the thyroid gland. And those blood vessels will eventually meet up with other blood vessels, that's circulation, right? And then travel to a different area of the body via the vascular system. Different from exocrine. So this is like a sweat gland, for example. So an exocrine gland secretes its contents through a duct. So here's the cells that actually line that duct. And they secrete into that duct, and then eventually that sweat goes to the outside environment. So no blood vessel involvement here. So endocrine is secreting into the blood vessels. Exocrine is secreting into something besides the blood vessel, like a duct or directly to the outside environment. Okay, so a gland is defined as a group of cells within an organ that function together to form hormones. So for example, here's your thyroid gland. So this is a group of cells that form this glandular tissue, and they are forming hormones. And those hormones are secreted into the bloodstream and then travel a distance away to a target tissue. And the target tissue is responsive to certain hormones. So that target tissue has specific receptors on the cell surface that are specific to that hormone. So if the thyroid gland wanted to release its hormones, but the thyroid hormone has nothing to do with, let's say, the kidneys, for example, then those kidney cells don't have a receptor to that thyroid hormone. It wouldn't influence them. Okay, so the receptors on the target tissue are very specific to the hormone that's going to affect them. And the receptor, I just mean a binding location for that hormone to bind. We're going to get into that a little bit more detail here. Okay, so in summary here, hormones are produced by endocrine glands, okay? And they're stored in interstitial tissue. So they may be stored in the endocrine cell, but a lot of times they may be stored in this tissue here surrounding the cells, which is interstitial tissue. Interstitial means between the cells. From here, they're going to diffuse into the bloodstream and then travel throughout the body. That's why the endocrine glands are so far apart from each other, because they can travel via the bloodstream. And they're going to act on target cells that are quite a distance away. And there's a couple terms here to know about this. So the term autocrine means that the secretions affect the secreting cells themselves. So let's just say that this thyroid gland releases T3 and T4. That T3 and T4 isn't going to necessarily travel a very long distance through the bloodstream. It might travel from this cell to this cell, for example. It's all within the same gland. So some endocrine glands are autocrine, meaning they kind of stimulate themselves with their secretions. Another term would be paracrine, which is when the secretions enter this interstitial space and then act on nearby cells. So for example, a leukocyte is a white blood cell. So let's just say that a white blood cell is here in the bloodstream and it releases something called histamine. Okay, histamine is going to act on the blood vessel wall. So very close neighboring structure there. And so paracrine would be acting on a very close by tissue. And again, hormones have to bind to specific receptors for that hormone in order for that hormone to work. And so it's very important that that hormone ends up at the correct target tissue so that it can induce a response. When we talk about the endocrine system, we are talking about these anatomical structures. Okay, so notice how they're very far apart from each other. We have from the brain all the way down to the reproductive tract. But remember that that's okay, because these endocrine structures release hormones that travel via the bloodstream. And we know that our entire body is full of blood vessels. So that's okay. It's going to do what it needs to do, right? Let's start up at the brain here. So we have an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. And if you haven't had 215 yet with the nervous system, the hypothalamus sits kind of right behind the frontal lobe here, right above, kind of anterior to this midbrain, the very top of the brainstem. That's called the hypothalamus. Hanging off below the hypothalamus, you have a little, I like to call it a bean structure. That's what it literally looks like. It looks like a little bean. That's called the pituitary gland. Okay, so the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are very close to each other, and there's a reason why. The pituitary gland is split up into a front and a back, or an anterior and a posterior pituitary. Okay. Back here in the back of the brain towards the cerebellum area, in the posterior middle brain, we have something called the pineal gland. That is going to be the gland that secretes melatonin for sleep and circadian rhythm. Okay, so this is kind of the main hub that we're going to start with. Going down the body, we're just going to keep going down the midline, essentially. We have a thyroid gland here. It kind of surrounds the larynx. The thyroid looks like a butterfly shape. On the back of that thyroid, there are little dots. And that is the parathyroid tissue. So the parathyroid is not shown here, but if we were to turn that thyroid around and look at it from the posterior view, you would have these little dots, 4 little dots, and that's called the parathyroid gland. That's on the back of the thyroid gland. Going down the midline here, right in the sternal area, we have something called the thymus gland, something that maybe some of you are not super familiar with, but the thymus gland is very active in infants. Has to do with immunity. We'll get to that a little bit later. Moving down here, we have this little organ called the pancreas. The pancreas sits, the stomach sits about right here, liver sits over here, and the intestines sit here and kind of encompass that pancreas. So the pancreas is another endocrine gland. Interestingly enough, the pancreas is also an exocrine gland. So it actually has dual function, endocrine and exocrine. And we'll get to its exocrine function when we get to the digestive system. But for this week's module, we are just going to focus on its endocrine function. Okay, sitting on top of the kidneys, we have these two glands called the adrenal glands. So those are going to be important here. And then we have the reproductive glands, which would be ovaries in a biological female or testes in a biological male. Okay, so the interesting thing here that we're going to talk about is that, let's just say the anterior pituitary gland up here secretes a hormone that actually targets the testes and the ovaries. How does it get there? It travels through the bloodstream. So just remember that all these hormones travel throughout the body via the bloodstream, and so they are able to act on a target tissue quite a distance away. Other structures that we're not going to get into too much detail quite yet would be your liver, your heart, your kidneys, and your GI tract. A lot of these we're going to get to when we get to the cardiovascular system, the urinary system, and the gastrointestinal digestive system. So just hang on to those for just a little bit here. Now, I'm an anatomist, and so I love to focus on histology, which is the study of tissues. It's very important in order to determine how a structure works in its anatomical microscopic state. Now, as we go through these histological images, I'm going to point out just a couple things about them. You don't have to know everything about these histological images. I would never, give you something and tell me everything about it that you possibly can. The best way to go about these histological images would be to take kind of a mental screenshot of the image, look for key landmarks or key colors or shapes, things that are going to help you remember what these tissues are. And so we're going to kind of go through some of the histology here. So here is a cross section. Oh, and when we talk about histology, we're talking about taking a structure and then slicing it into very fine slices. And so this is a cross section. If we took the whole pituitary gland and cut a piece out of it, this is what it would look like. So here's the pituitary, and remember it hangs off of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus would be up in this region. This stalk, pituitary stalk, is also called the infundibulum, which is, your book talks about the infundibulum. That is important for how hypothalamic hormones get into or stimulate the anterior and posterior pituitary. But when you see this pituitary gland, you notice right away that we have a darker color here and we have a lighter color here. So the darker region of the pituitary is always going to be the anterior or the front. The lighter area is going to be the posterior pituitary or the back. And the makeup of each of these structures is important for function. And so the anterior is dark because it has a lot of tightly packed, dense glandular cells there. Secretory cells. So the anterior pituitary makes its own hormones. And that's important because that's what those secretory cells are there to do. Now, the posterior pituitary does not make its own hormones. It is stimulated by the nervous system, axons, which are little projections off of a neuron that stimulate a target cell or a postsynaptic cell. And the axons travel down this infundibulum and then stimulate this posterior pituitary to release its contents or its hormones. Now, this doesn't have glandular cells in it, or very few, right? So where do those hormones come from? They're actually made up in the hypothalamus, and they're dropped down into the posterior pituitary for storage. Okay, so the difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary is that the anterior pituitary makes its own hormones, and then is stimulated by hormones from the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary hormones are made in the hypothalamus, drop down into the posterior pituitary for storage, and then the posterior pituitary is stimulated by the nervous system, by a nerve impulse from the hypothalamus. So very different functions here for a gland that's essentially the same structure. It does have this like division point in between. We're not going to get into all of that anatomy, but very, very interesting little gland here. Okay, and overall, the purpose of the pituitary is to stimulate other glands a distance away. Okay, so up in the brain and traveling down the bloodstream to stimulate a gland somewhere else in the body. We're going to get into more of the function here in a couple lectures. Here is a histological image of a cross-section of the thyroid. When you look at the thyroid gland, you see these kind of translucent or sometimes opaque, colored, dyed centers, and they look like little bubbles. And each bubble is surrounded by a layer of cells here. And if you've had 215, you would recognize these cells as something called simple cuboidal. Simple just means one layer. Cuboidal means that they are square shaped. I know they don't look square shaped, but histology is an art, and you have to really look at a lot of images to be able to tell that. But that's not the point. The point is that having a simple layer of cells around each of these bubbles, or these are actually called follicles. Hormone is stored in these follicles, the thyroid hormones T3 and T4, and they can easily exit these follicles into the bloodstream through just one layer of cells, just one layer of kind of a boundary, right? So you see this colloid center that's here, that's where that hormone is located, T3, T4. You also have these parafollicular cells, which are going to be like the interstitial cells. When I say interstitial cells, I'm just talking about cells other than what's wrapping each follicle. So these cells are wrapping this follicle, but what about all these cells? And what about all these cells? These are all parafollicular cells. And those are just involved in helping make some hormone, but also detecting the external environment. So that's the thyroid. Parathyroid kind of looks like a mess. But the parathyroid gland, if we were to be able to zoom in on this, which this is about as close as we can get here for the sake of this class, but there are different staining cells and different shaped cells in here. I know it doesn't totally look like it. Each of these is a nuclei though. Each of these dark circles is a nuclei, which means that there's tons and tons of cells in this image. But there's chief cells and there's oxyphil cells in here. They're just named for how they stain and what they look like. But essentially, these two types of cells are not only sensing changes in blood calcium level, but they're also producing PTH or parathyroid hormone, which helps to regulate blood calcium level. So the main thing I want you to know about the parathyroid and thyroid is that they look very different, right? So here's your thyroid. You have some dense cells, but those are all interstitial cells, but mainly you have these follicles. That's thyroid. Notice how the parathyroid doesn't have any of those follicles. This is just dead space here. This is just connective tissue dead space. Just mostly dense cells all throughout the gland. So very different, but right next door to each other, right? The parathyroid sits on the back of the thyroid. This is an image of the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys again. And when we talk about the cortex and the medulla of something, you may remember this if you've had 215 and did the brain. But the cortex is always going to be an outer layer, and the medulla is going to be the inner layer. So if we take, let's see here, we take this little adrenal gland right here and cut it open, we're going to have an outer layer and we're going to have an inner, like an inside layer. And then we're going to have an outer layer again, right? So we have this kind of inner center, and then we have this outer area. So if we look at that on a histological image, you may already have an idea that this darker area is all cortex. And this inner lighter area is all medulla. Okay, so the cortex is the outer region, the medulla is the center. And in terms of endocrinology, the adrenal cortex and medulla do very different things, and they release very different hormones. But essentially, the cortex has a lot of cells, very tightly packed masses of cells. They release corticosteroids, so like your cortisol is released out here from your cortex. Your medulla is stimulated by the nervous system. Your cortex is stimulated by your pituitary gland. So we'll get to that. But the cortex is stimulated by the pituitary. The medulla is stimulated by the nervous system. So again, we kind of have one of those scenarios with the anterior posterior pituitary, where the anterior was glandular and was stimulated by the hypothalamus, and so it's darker. And the posterior pituitary was stimulated by the nervous system and was lighter. So again, kind of the same story, if that helps you remember what this looks like. But we have a lot of layers here. They're called zona XYZ. We're not going to go into all of those zones. That's not necessary. But your cortex is darker, your medulla is lighter. This cortex is stimulated by the anterior pituitary, and this medulla is stimulated by the nervous system. And that will make sense when we talk about what hormones are released here. This medulla area, the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine are released here. And those have to do with your fight or flight response. And if you're not familiar with fight or flight, it's like when you get really nervous or scared and your blood pressure goes up and your heart rate goes up and your respiratory rate goes up and all those things kind of increase. And that's a nervous system response. Pancreas. This is as much of the pancreas as I want you to know right here. This is a magical little circle, and this is called an islet, I-S-L-E-T, islet. Within this pancreatic islet, which there are tons and tons of these little islets throughout the entire pancreas, within here we have different types of cells. I don't need you to know the difference between all of these cells. But there's different cells in here that are going to release hormones based upon what your blood glucose levels are. So the pancreas has, remember, endocrine and exocrine function. The endocrine function has to do with regulation of glucose levels. When we do exocrine, that has a digestive function in terms of like enzymes. Okay, so we have alpha and beta cells all in this mess right here. Again, don't need you to know the difference between the two. But essentially the alpha cells secrete something called glucagon, which when we get to this in more detail, glucagon is responsible for rising the blood sugar when your blood sugar is low. So let's just say you haven't eaten for a while. Well, why can you go without eating for a while? Why can you do a prolonged fast? Because glucagon is taking over and providing some stored glucose for you and putting it into the bloodstream. And then insulin does the opposite. It's going to lower your blood sugar. So after you eat a meal, if you're not diabetic, why doesn't that meal spike your blood sugar for prolonged periods of time? Well, because that insulin comes in and it binds up some of that glucose, stores it into your body like fat in your liver, and puts it out of the bloodstream so that your blood glucose doesn't get too high. Negative feedback. Okay, we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail, but essentially when you see the pancreas, you should see this circular area of lighter staining area, and that's called the pancreatic islet. Your thymus looks a lot like the adrenal, kind of, I think, with the outer cortex being darker and the medulla being lighter. But for simplicity's sake, notice how this thymus gland is divided up into these lobes. So that's one key difference that you can kind of use to help you. All of these lobes here are lobes of the thymus. So that's why it looks a little bit different than the adrenal. It's not split up into lobes here. It's just one continuous tissue. This one's split up into lobes. So again, cortex, medulla. The thymus gland has an immunity function. We're going to get into it a little bit more detail here in the future lectures. but essentially your T cells, which are T lymphocytes, memory immune cells, are made out here in the cortex. And then as they migrate to the center, they're going to mature. And then those T cells will enter the bloodstream. There's all blood vessels in here as well. And those blood vessels will enter, or excuse me, those T cells will enter the blood vessels and then be able to travel throughout the body and promote those immune responses when needed. This is a picture of an ovary. So here's the ovary here, and then here's the beginning of the uterine tube. The old term would be fallopian tube, but the newer term is uterine tube. Within this ovary, we know that we have egg production or oocyte production. And you see these bubble structures of all different sizes, right? Here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one, here's one. These are huge, right? And those are all follicles. And within those follicles, you'll have a developing egg, like here. Here would be one here, one here. So you're going to have developing eggs within these follicles, and they're all at different stages. So once a month, women release a mature egg from a follicle, and the follicles that actually release their eggs are about this big. So this is a very mature follicle. The immature follicles are going to be way out here in the cortex. All these little dots here. And then these are all pretty immature follicles. But once a month, one egg that becomes this big with a little egg in it is going to release its egg for ovulation. And so women are born with as many eggs as you'll ever have in your lifetime. So here's all of the little potential suitors to make an egg to be ovulated. And those are called primordial follicles. So eggs are going to mature from the cortex inwards towards the medulla and then be ovulated once a month. So the purpose of the ovaries are to house and mature an oocyte or an egg for ovulation. And we'll get into more detail about other functions of this later on. Here's an up-close picture of the testes. So the testes are actually full of little tubes, little ducts called the seminiferous tubules. And so here's a tubule here, here's a tubule here, okay? And this is the lumen or the opening of that tube. So imagine like a straw. If you have a straw and you cut it, right? You have the opening to the straw and then you have the outer part of the straw. So the opening of the straw would be here and then this is the outer part. And kind of like with the ovaries, sperm mature from the outside of the tubule inwards. So these are all very immature sperm cells out here. And then the mature sperm cells are going to be here. And you can actually see their heads will be here. And then their tails will come out into this lumen environment, which you can see little tails all throughout here. It's angled up. So these tubules promote sperm production. The interstitial cells, again, here's that word again. So interstitial means between whatever you're looking at. So we're looking at these tubules. So interstitial cells are going to be anything other than that, right? So these would be good interstitial cells. That is where testosterone is produced. That's an endocrine hormone. Testosterone is necessary for sperm maturation. So very close by, right? Paracrine, right? So these cells produce testosterone that jumps the bridge over here and stimulates these sperm to become more mature. And I did mention that there's other structures here, liver, heart, kidneys, GI tract. We're not going to go into too much detail. We're not going to do the histology of all of these structures, but just kind of know that there are some hormones released by the liver, the heart, the kidneys, and the GI tract that you might not always think about. So the liver secretes something called erythropoietin. And what erythropoietin does, and we'll get to this again when we get into the blood section, is that erythropoietin stimulates red blood cell production. And where red blood cells are produced is in the bone marrow. So the liver makes this hormone and actually stimulates bone marrow anywhere in, not anywhere in the body, but in the major bone marrow producing areas of the body. So here's a good example of a hormone being created in an organ and then traveling through the bloodstream to the bones that are going to contain the marrow, capable of making red blood cells. It also has a function in some blood pressure regulation, iron level regulation, and growth hormone regulation. So a lot of kind of miscellaneous functions here. It releases hormones to help with this, but also little peptides, little proteins that are going to help with that. We'll get into more of that later. The heart does have some endocrine function. It releases things called natriuretic peptides, which are going to rise or lower the blood pressure. There's two different types. We'll talk about that when we get to the cardiovascular system. The kidneys also secrete erythropoietin. Most of the erythropoietin is secreted in the kidneys, about 85%. So again, stimulating red blood cell production, but the kidneys also play a role in calcium and blood pressure regulation as well, endocrine wise. And this one actually makes sense. Some of these might not make a whole lot of sense to you, but the GI tract secretes some enteric hormones or digestive hormones that induce the feelings of hunger, fullness, and also helps things move through the gastrointestinal tract at the correct speed. And so these are just kind of FYIs here, things that might come up a little bit later. We're definitely going to talk about these enteric hormones when we get to digestive. We'll talk about some of this blood pressure regulation, hormone stuff when we get to kidneys. So these things will come up later as well. All right, so that concludes our lecture 1 over the anatomy of the endocrine system. And then in the next coming lectures, we're going to talk about types of hormones, functions of hormones, as well as some physiology of each gland and what hormones they release and what those hormones target.